Imagine this. A Hollywood legend steps onto a stage, expecting respect, only to face a storm of insult from a ruthless talk show host. What happens next will leave you speechless. This is Morgan Freeman Confronts, a rude talk show host. His response leaves the audience speechless. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that'll tug at your heartstrings, and stick around till the end. You won't want to miss a single word. The air in Atlanta buzzed with excitement that humid Georgia night. Inside the brightly lit studio on Peachtree Street, every seat was filled, every eye glued to the stage. The scent of roasted pecans drifted in from a nearby cafe, blending with the electric hum of anticipation. Lila Live, Atlanta's hottest talk show, was about to go on air, and tonight's guest was none other than Morgan Freeman. 86 years young, a voice that could calm storms, a man who'd seen all. The crowd erupted as he stepped out, slow and steady, his gray suit catching the spotlight. "Good evening, Atlanta," he said, that deep, familiar timbre rolling through the room like a warm wave. People cheered, some stood, a few wiped tears just hearing him speak. But something was off. Lila Hayes, the host with a razor-sharp tongue, sat poised in her sleek black chair, a smirk tugging at her lips. She'd built her empire on bold questions and brutal honesty, and tonight she had a legend in her sights. As Morgan settled in, the applause faded, and Lila leaned forward, her voice smooth yet edged with a bite. "Morgan, let's cut to it. At 86, do you ever think you're past your prime? I mean, Hollywood moves fast, too fast for an old-timer like you, right?" The room froze. A gasp rippled through the audience. An elderly woman in the front row clutched her purse, her eyes wide. Past his prime? Morgan Freeman? The man who'd narrated life itself? He didn't flinch. He folded his hands in his lap, his gaze locking onto Lila's like a quiet storm brewing. "Lila," he began, his tone steady, deliberate. "Do you ever wonder what keeps a man going at my age?" She blinked, caught off guard, but recovered fast. "Oh, I'm sure it's nostalgia," she shot back, laughing lightly. "Clinging to the glory days, right?" Behind the scenes, Earl Jackson, the 60-year-old producer with salt and pepper hair, paced in the control room. "She's pushing it too far," he muttered, rubbing his temples. Earl had seen Lila take risks before, but this was Morgan Freeman. Beside him, Tasha Brooks, Lila's ambitious 20-something assistant, grinned. "No, Earl, this is gold. Let her dig. She'll break him." Earl shook his head. "You don't break a man like that, Tasha. You just don't." Back on stage, the tension thickened. Lila leaned closer, her smirk widening. "Come on, Morgan. You've played God, narrated the universe, but let's be real. You're just an old man now. Don't you ever feel irrelevant?" The word hung in the air, sharp and cold. A man in the crowd clenched his fists, whispering to his wife. She didn't just say that. Another woman, her silver hair catching the light, covered her mouth, a tear slipping down her cheek. Morgan exhaled slowly, his eyes deep and unreadable. The camera zoomed in, catching every line on his face, lines that told stories of pain, triumph, love. He tilted his head, just a fraction, and spoke. "Lila Hayes," he said, his voice low, commanding, "have you ever held someone's hand as they took their last breath?" Silence. Dead silence. Lila's smirk faltered. The audience held their breath, every soul in that Atlanta studio hanging on his next word. Earl froze mid-step, whispering, "Here it comes." Tasha's grin vanished, her eyes darting to the monitor. What had Lila just unleashed? Morgan leaned forward, his presence filling the room, and the world tilted on its edge. Something big was coming, something no one could have predicted. The Atlanta studio was a pressure cooker, the air thick with stunned silence after Morgan Freeman's piercing question hung unanswered. "Have you ever held someone's hand as they took their last breath?" he'd asked, his voice a quiet thunder that rattled Lila Hayes to her core. Her perfectly rehearsed smirk flickered, then faded. She opened her mouth, but no clever comeback came. "Well, she stammered, her eyes darting to the audience for rescue. None came. The crowd sat motionless, every face etched with a mix of awe and unease. Morgan didn't let up. He leaned in closer, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers like a preacher staring down a lost soul. "I have, Lila," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "Too many times. Friends, family, people who shaped me." A hush fell over the room, so heavy you could hear the faint buzz of the studio lights. He paused, letting the weight settle. "And you know what they taught me? Time doesn't care about fame or youth. It cares about what you do with it." Lila swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her cue cards. She forced a laugh, sharp and brittle. "That's poetic, Morgan, but let's be honest. You're 86. Hollywood's moved on. Don't you ever wake up feeling forgotten?" The jab landed like a slap, and the audience gasped again. A man in a plaid shirt muttered, "She's digging her own grave." Beside him, an older woman with a gospel hymnal in her lap shook her head, whispering, "Lord, give her grace." In the control room, Earl Jackson's jaw clenched. "She's lost it," he growled, reaching for the comms button. "We need to cut to commercial, now." But Tasha Brooks grabbed his arm, her voice electric with excitement. "No way, Earl. This is raw. This is real. Let her push him. He'll crack." Earl yanked his arm free, glaring at her. "Crack Morgan Freeman? Girl, you don't know who you're dealing with." Back on stage, the tension was a living thing, wrapping around every soul in that Atlanta studio. Morgan didn't flinch. He rubbed his fingers together, a habit when he was deep in thought, and then his voice rolled out again, rich and steady. "Forgotten, you say? Lila, let me tell you something about being forgotten." He paused, his gaze sweeping the audience, pulling them in. "Back in '72, I was here in Atlanta, sitting with a friend, James, a stagehand who never got his big break. Cancer took him slow. I held his hand till the end." A woman in the third row pressed a tissue to her eyes, her shoulders trembling. Morgan's voice softened, but it cut deeper. James didn't have Oscars or headlines, but he had love for his craft, his people. And when he died, he wasn't forgotten. Not by me. The room was a sea of held breaths, every word sinking into the hearts of those watching. Lila shifted in her seat, her confidence unraveling. "That's a nice story," she said, her tone biting, "but this isn't 1972. You're not that young man anymore. What's left for you now?" The question was a dagger, meant to wound. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some angry, some pained. Earl cursed under his breath. "She's begging for it." Tasha leaned forward, eyes wide, whispering, "Come on, old man, fight back." Morgan tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He leaned back, calm as a Georgia sunset, and spoke. "What's left? Oh, Lila, everything's left. Because every day I wake up, I choose faith over fear." The words hit like a tidal wave. Lila blinked, her mask slipping further. The audience leaned forward, hungry for more. Earl dropped his hand from the comms, muttering, "That's it, Morgan. Give it to her." Tasha's grin faltered. She hadn't expected this. Morgan's eyes glinted with a fire that age couldn't dim, and he wasn't done. "You want to talk about what's left?" he said, his voice rising just enough to shake the room. "Let's talk about what's left for you, Lila Hayes." The studio erupted in a collective gasp. The tables had turned, and no one, not Lila, not the audience, not even Tasha, knew what was coming next. Something seismic was building, and Atlanta would never forget it. The Atlanta studio was a powder keg, and Morgan Freeman had just lit the fuse. His words, "Let's talk about what's left for you, Lila Hayes," hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through every corner of the room. Lila froze, her cue cards trembling in her hands. The audience erupted, a tidal wave of gasps and murmurs crashing over the stage. A man in a Braves cap shouted, "Tell her, Morgan," while an elderly woman with a gospel hymnal clutched it to her chest, whispering, "Hallelujah. He's preaching now." The energy was raw, electric, like a revival meeting on the brink of revelation. Lila's eyes darted to the crowd, then back to Morgan. She forced a laugh, but it cracked like thin ice. "Me? Oh, please, Morgan. I'm at the top of my game. You're the one clinging to the past." Her voice was sharp, desperate, but it couldn't mask the tremor beneath. Morgan didn't blink. He leaned forward, his presence towering despite the years etched into his face. "Top of your game?" he said, his tone low, cutting. "Then why do you sound so scared, Lila?" The room went still. Scared? Lila Hayes, the queen of fearless interviews, scared? A woman in the front row clutched her husband's hand, her eyes brimming with tears. Lila opened her mouth to fire back, but Morgan pressed on, relentless. "I've lived long enough to know fear when I hear it," he said, "and you're drowning in it. Afraid of being forgotten. Afraid your words don't matter. Afraid you've built a castle on sand." His voice was a blade, slicing through her bravado, exposing the cracks she'd hidden for years. In the control room, Earl Jackson dropped into his chair, stunned. "He's reading her soul," he muttered, his voice thick with awe. Tasha Brooks, wide-eyed, shook her head. No, she's got this. She'll turn it around." But Lila wasn't turning anything. She gripped her chair, her knuckles white, as Morgan's words sliced deeper. "You asked what's left for me," he continued, his voice rising like a gospel swell. "Let me tell you about my mother, Lila. A cleaner here in Atlanta. Worked her hands raw to raise me. She never had a stage, never had a spotlight. But she had faith in love in me. And when she died, I carried her lessons every damn day." A sob broke from the audience, raw and unrestrained. A man in his 70s lowered his head, his shoulders shaking as memories flooded back. Maybe of his own mother, gone too soon. Morgan's eyes softened, but his fire didn't waver. "That's what's left for me. Her strength, her love. Pain taught me that, Lila. Pain's a hell of a teacher. What's it taught you?" The question landed like a punch, and Lila flinched. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. The camera zoomed in, catching the sheen of sweat on her brow, the crack in her armor widening as the weight of his words crushed her defiance. Earl slammed his fist on the desk. Cut it now, she's done." Tasha lunged forward, her voice frantic. "No, Earl, this is viral gold. Let him bury her." Earl spun on her, furious. "Bury her? He's burying us all if this goes south." On stage, Lila scrambled for control. "Pain," she spat, her voice shaking. "I've fought harder than you ever did, Morgan. You think you're special because you're old? Hollywood's done with you. It's my time now." Her words were a last-ditch swing, but they rang hollow against the truth Morgan wielded. The crowd roared, some cheering, some booing, the room splitting down the middle. Morgan exhaled, slow and steady, his calm a stark contrast to Lila's unraveling. "Your time?" he said, almost a whisper, yet it silenced the chaos. "My dear, time doesn't care about your spotlight. It cares about your heart. And right now, yours is screaming for something you won't name." He paused, letting it sink in, his gaze piercing her soul. "So tell me, Lila, what are you so afraid of losing?" The question shattered her. Lila's breath hitched, her eyes glistening under the harsh lights. A single tear slipped down her cheek, caught on camera for all of Atlanta to see. The audience fell silent, stunned, as the invincible Lila Hayes broke before their eyes. A woman in the back whispered, "My God, she's human after all." Earl stared at the monitor, breathless. "He's got her. He's really got her." Tasha sank back, speechless, her ambition crumbling as she watched her idol falter. Morgan leaned back, his gaze steady but kind, giving Lila space to breathe or fall. The room pulsed with emotion, every soul hanging on the edge. Lila wiped her face, her voice barely audible. I don't know," she whispered, the confession tearing through her pride like a storm through a fragile roof. And with that, the tide turned. Something bigger than an interview was unfolding. Something Atlanta would carry in its heart forever. The Atlanta studio was a battlefield of emotions, the silence deafening after Lila Hayes' whispered confession. I don't know." Her tear-streaked face glowed under the harsh lights, a fallen queen stripped bare. The audience sat stunned, their breaths held tight, as Morgan Freeman's question, "What are you so afraid of losing?" echoed in their hearts. A woman in a floral dress gripped her husband's arm, whispering, "She's lost everything now." But Morgan? He didn't gloat. He sat back, his eyes warm, yet unyielding. giving her room to crumble or rise. Lila's hand shook as she wiped her cheeks, her voice a fragile thread. "You don't get it, Morgan," she said, forcing the words out. "I've clawed my way up from nothing." "Nothing? You think I'm scared?" "I'm not. I'm fighting." The desperation in her tone cracked the air, raw and jagged. Morgan tilted his head, his calm a lighthouse in her storm. "Fighting what, Lila?" he asked, soft but piercing. "Yourself? Because that's the only enemy I see here." The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock spreading like wildfire. A man in the back stood up, shouting, "Say it, Lila. Say the truth." Another voice, softer, trembled from the front row. "Please, just listen to him." Lila's eyes darted to the audience, then back to Morgan, her defenses crumbling. "You don't know me," she snapped, but her voice broke mid-sentence. "You don't know what it's like to be a nobody from Georgia, laughed at, told you'll never make it." Morgan's gaze softened, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Oh, I know that story," he said, his voice rich with memory. "I was that nobody once. Right here in Atlanta. My father walked out. My mother scrubbed floors to feed me. I was laughed at too. Lila, called a dreamer with no shot. But I learned something you haven't." He paused, letting the silence pull her in. "Pain doesn't define you. What you do with it does." A sob escaped Lila, loud and unguarded, echoing through the studio. The camera caught it all, her mascara running, her shoulders heaving. In the control room, Earl Jackson leaned forward, his voice hushed. "She's breaking wide open. My God, he's saving her." Tasha Brooks turned away, her arms crossed, muttering, "This isn't what I signed up for. She's weak." Earl shot her a glare. "Weak? No, Tasha. She's human, and he's showing her how to be strong." On stage, Lila's breath hitched as memories flooded her. Nights crying in a rundown trailer, kids mocking her secondhand clothes, her mother's voice saying, "Prove him wrong, baby." She looked at Morgan, her eyes pleading. "How do you do it?" she whispered. "How do you carry all that and still smile?" Morgan leaned in, his voice a gentle anchor. "Faith, Lila. Faith in something bigger than me. I wake up every day choosing it. Over fear, over bitterness. You can too." The room stilled, every soul hanging on his words. A woman in the audience clutched her necklace, tears streaming as she nodded. Lila's lip quivered, her pride in tatters. "I've been so angry," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Angry at the world and myself. I thought tearing others down would make me feel enough." Morgan nodded, his eyes kind but firm. "And does it?" he asked. She shook her head, a broken no slipping out, and the dam burst. Tears poured down her face, her sobs shaking the stage. The crowd softened, a wave of empathy washing over them. A man in his 60s wiped his eyes, whispering, "I've been there, girl." Earl stood up, his voice steady. "Let roll, Tasha. This is bigger than ratings now." Tasha scoffed, but said nothing, her defiance fading. Morgan reached out, his hand resting near Lila's. "It's not too late," he said, his tone a lifeline. "You've got a voice, Lila, a powerful one. Use it to lift people up. Change the story." Lila looked at him, her eyes red but alive, a spark igniting where despair had reigned. She inhaled sharply, her voice trembling but resolute. I want to try," she said, and the audience erupted, applause thundering through the studio. Morgan smiled, small but real, and leaned back. The tide had turned, not just for Lila, but for everyone watching. Something sacred was unfolding, and Atlanta felt it deep in its bones. The Atlanta studio quaked with emotion, applause roaring like a summer storm after Lila Hayes' vow, "I'll do better." Her tear-stained face shone with fragile resolve, a woman reborn from pride's ashes. The audience stood, clapping through tears, strangers grasping hands in awe. Morgan Freeman sat calm, his faint smile a steady light in the chaos. Lila's voice trembled as she faced him. "You think I can change?" Morgan nodded, his deep tone warm. "I know you can, Lila. Turn your fire into light." Cheers erupted, a man shouting, "You got this, Lila." A woman with a hymnal whispered, "He's raising her up." In the control room, Earl Jackson grinned wide. "That's real TV," he said, voice thick with pride. Tasha Brooks muttered, not just an old man, huh? Earl chuckled. Never was. Lila steadied herself, asking, first step? Morgan pointed to the crowd. Look at them. They're here for your heart. Start there. The camera panned. A woman clutching her grandma's hand. A man nodding through tears. A couple embracing tight. Lila's breath caught as she saw them. Truly saw them. I've been blind, she whispered, voice cracking. Morgan's smile softened. Blindness is a start, if you choose to see. A clap broke the silence. Then a flood, the studio shaking with applause. Lila's eyes glistened with hope. Morgan rose, offering his hand. She took it, whispering, thank you. He squeezed back. Make it count. The crowd roared as Lila turned to them. I promise, I'll do better. For you, she said, voice rising strong. A gospel hymn swelled. Amazing grace, lifting the room. Lila called, wait, your message. Morgan paused, turning, eyes skyward. Life ain't about years. It's about love you give every day, he said, voice a soul-deep echo. Cheers mixed with sobs, some dialing loved ones on the spot. Morgan walked off, leaving a legacy. Atlanta felt it, a call to love, to heal. If this moved you, hit like and share it. Comment. What's your takeaway? Subscribe for more. Life's about love. Go give some today.